What happens when royalty meets reality television and egos collide in the most spectacular fashion? In just 35 seconds, a prince would go from honored guest to being escorted off set, all because he couldn't handle the truth. This is the story of how one talk show host stood his ground against entitlement, and how a single interview became the most talked about television moment of the year. The green room backstage was buzzing with energy. Staff members rushed back and forth, making final preparations for what everyone knew would be a memorable show. Hair and makeup teams hovered nervously, waiting for their moment with tonight's very special guest. The atmosphere was electric, the kind that only comes when you know you're about to witness something big, something that people will be talking about for weeks. Everyone could feel it in their bones. Tonight's guest wasn't just anyone. Tonight, they had royalty. Tonight, they had Prince Harry. Jon Stewart sat behind his desk on the main stage, the studio lights bright and hot as always. He'd done this routine 1,000 times before, maybe even more. The pre-show checks, the microphone adjustments, the quick review of notes scribbled on index cards. But something felt different tonight, and Jon could sense it. His producers had been hyping this interview for weeks, talking excitedly about ratings and buzz and how this could potentially be the biggest show of the entire season, maybe even the year. Prince Harry walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, waving to the audience with that practiced royal wave he'd perfected over decades of public appearances. The crowd erupted in genuine excitement, their cheers overwhelming the studio space. Camera flashes popped from the audience like tiny fireworks. People stood up from their seats, craning their necks to get a better look at actual royalty standing just feet away from them. Harry soaked it all in, that famous smile plastered across his face, the one he'd perfected over years and years of ribbon cuttings and charity galas and public events where everyone wanted a piece of him. He sat down across from Jon, adjusting his expensive jacket with deliberate care, smoothing out invisible wrinkles with his hands. He flashed a confident smile, the kind that said he knew exactly why everyone was watching, exactly what power his presence held in this room. Jon extended his hand for a professional handshake, and Harry took it firmly, his grip strong, almost too strong, like he was trying to establish dominance from the very first moment of contact. "Welcome to the show," Jon said, keeping his tone friendly but professional, the way he always did with new guests. "We've been looking forward to having you here. It's not every day we get royalty in the studio." "Happy to be here," Harry replied smoothly, settling into his chair like he owned the place. Like he'd been doing talk shows his entire life. He crossed one leg over the other, leaning back. With the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life, someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. The audience settled down gradually, the excitement morphing into attentive silence as they waited to hear what would be said. Jon started with the usual softballs, the warm-up questions that every single talk show host uses to ease guests into the real conversation, to make them comfortable before things get interesting. How was Harry enjoying his time in America? What did he think of California compared to London? What projects was he currently working on? What causes was he passionate about? Harry answered each question with rehearsed precision, his responses flowing smoothly like he'd practiced them in front of a mirror dozens of times. He dropped names casually, mentioning celebrities and causes like they were just part of his everyday life, like having dinner with movie stars was as normal as breathing. He talked about charity work with the practiced ease of someone who'd been media trained since childhood, hitting all the right notes, saying all the things people wanted to hear. The audience seemed engaged, nodding along approvingly, occasionally applauding when he mentioned something particularly noble or heartwarming. But Jon could sense something underneath the polished exterior, something that didn't sit quite right. There was an edge to Harry's responses, a smugness that was starting to show through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The way he emphasized certain words, the way his eyes would flash with something darker when Jon asked anything that wasn't purely congratulatory. It was subtle, but it was definitely there. Jon had interviewed enough people over his long career to recognize the signs. This wasn't someone who wanted a genuine conversation. This was someone who wanted a platform, someone who wanted validation, someone who expected everyone to simply agree with everything he said. "So, let's talk about your book," Jon said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk in front of him. "You've been pretty open about your family, your struggles, your experiences growing up in the public eye. Some people have said you're airing private family matters for profit, that you're capitalizing on family drama and intimate moments that should have stayed private. What do you say to those people?" The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. Harry's smile tightened noticeably, his jaw clenching just slightly. The relaxed posture stiffened. For just a brief moment, the mask slipped, and something darker flashed across his face before he caught himself and smoothed it back into place, back into that practiced public persona. I say those people don't understand what it's like to grow up in a system that protects itself at all costs, Harry said, his voice taking on a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. They don't know what it's like to be silenced, to have your truth suppressed, to not be allowed to speak your mind. I'm telling my truth. Finally, after years and years of not being allowed to speak, of being told to smile and wave and keep quiet. Your truth, Jon repeated slowly, nodding, letting the phrase hang in the air for a long moment. But isn't there something to be said for keeping family matters private? I mean, everyone has family drama. Everyone has disagreements with their relatives, difficult relationships, painful memories they'd rather forget. Most people just don't write best-selling books about it and go on international press tours talking about every detail. The audience laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind that comes when people aren't quite sure if they should be laughing, if it's appropriate given the tension building in the room. Harry's face shifted again. The smile was completely gone now, replaced by something harder, something less controlled, something that looked almost like anger. Most people aren't trapped in an institution that's centuries old and refuses to change. Harry shot back quickly, his voice rising. Most people aren't born into a system that controls every aspect of their lives. Most people have freedom, real freedom, not the illusion of it. You have freedom, Jon said calmly, not raising his voice, not matching Harry's energy. You left the institution. You moved to California. You're sitting here on my show right now, promoting your book, making your own choices, saying whatever you want. That sounds like freedom to me. That sounds like you have exactly what you say you wanted. Harry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively across his chest like a petulant child. You don't get it. You couldn't possibly understand the pressure, the constant scrutiny, the way they control everything, the way they manipulate the media, the way they protect themselves while throwing everyone else under the bus. I don't get it? Jon's eyebrows raised, slightly, his expression skeptical. Harry, I've been doing this show for years. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, activists, people who've actually changed the world in meaningful ways. And you know what? None of them ever sat in that chair and told me I couldn't understand their problems. None of them acted like their struggles were somehow more valid than everyone else's. The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension building in the studio, thick and heavy, like a storm about to break. This wasn't the friendly celebrity interview people had expected. This was becoming something else entirely, something uncomfortable, something real. That's different, Harry insisted, his voice rising even more. You interview politicians. You interview people who chose their paths. I was born into something I didn't choose. I didn't ask for any of this. That's not the same thing at all. No, you're absolutely right, Jon agreed. But his tone suggested he was about to make a point. It's not the same. Because most people who are born into difficult circumstances don't have palaces to live in and trust funds worth millions and worldwide platforms handed to them. They don't have the luxury of complaining about their privilege on international television while making millions of dollars doing it. Harry's face flushed red, anger radiating from every pore. Privilege? You think what I went through was privilege? You think losing my mother, being hounded by photographers, having every moment of my life scrutinized was privilege? I think you had advantages most people will never have in their entire lives, Jon said evenly, his voice steady and calm. And I think instead of acknowledging that basic fact, you're sitting here acting like you're the biggest victim in the world. And frankly, it's getting old. It's getting really old, the audience gasped audibly. Some people started clapping, clearly agreeing with Jon's assessment. Others sat in stunned silence, shocked that anyone would speak to royalty this way. Harry stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound echoing through the studio. I don't have to sit here and listen to this, Harry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Do you have any idea who I am? Yeah, Jon said simply, not standing, not backing down, maintaining his calm demeanor. I'm talking to a guy who's forgotten that respect is earned, not automatically given because of who your grandmother was or what family you were born into. Harry pointed a finger directly at Jon, his whole body tense with rage, practically vibrating. You're a bitter, small man who makes a living mocking people and tearing them down. You think you're some kind of hero because you tell jokes on television? You think you're important? You're nothing. You're absolutely nothing. Jon stayed seated, his expression remaining calm and composed. I'm nothing? Harry, I don't need a title to know who I am. I don't need to constantly tell everyone how hard my life is to feel important. I just show up every day, do my job to the best of my ability, and go home to my family. Maybe you should try it sometime instead of seeking validation from strangers. This is unbelievable, Harry said, starting to pace back and forth across the stage like a caged animal. I came here as a courtesy to you and your show. I gave you my valuable time. I agreed to this interview. And this is how you treat me? This is the respect I get? I'm treating you exactly like I'd treat anyone else who comes on this show, Jon replied firmly, with honesty and direct questions. If you can't handle that, if you can't handle someone not bowing and scraping and telling you how wonderful you are, then that's your problem, not mine. That's something you need to work on. Harry turned to face the audience, spreading his arms wide in a dramatic gesture. You see this? This is exactly what I'm talking about in my book. No respect, no decency, no understanding. Just attacks and mockery, and people trying to tear you down when you speak your truth. But the audience wasn't on his side like he clearly expected them to be. A few people actually booed him. Most just stared, uncomfortable and unsure what to do, shifting in their seats awkwardly. Jon remained calmly in his seat, watching Harry spiral completely out of control, watching this supposed prince lose every ounce of composure he'd walked in with. You think they're on your side? Harry said, gesturing wildly at Jon with both hands. They're sheep, all of them. They believe whatever you tell them because you're on television, because you have a platform. But I know the truth. I know what it's like to be manipulated by the media. I know what it's like to be lied about. Harry, Jon said, his voice firmer now, with real authority behind it. You need to calm down. You need to take a breath and get yourself under control. Don't tell me to calm down, Harry shouted, loud enough that people in the back row could probably hear him clearly. You don't tell me what to do. Nobody tells me what to do anymore. I'm done being told what to do, how to act, what to say. The producers were moving now, stepping quickly onto the stage from the wings. Security was being called over their radios. Jon could see them gathering in the shadows, ready to intervene if necessary. But he kept his eyes locked on Harry, watching this man completely unravel in real time, watching years of suppressed anger come pouring out in the worst possible way. You're a disgrace. Harry spat at Jon with real venom. You hide behind your desk and your jokes and your audience, but you're just a coward. You wouldn't last one single day in my world. You wouldn't survive it. And you wouldn't last one day in the real world, Jon countered steadily. The world where people don't automatically bow when you walk in a room, where your last name doesn't open every single door, where you actually have to work for respect instead of demanding it, where you have to prove your worth. Harry took an aggressive step toward the desk, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. For a brief moment, it genuinely looked like he might actually try something physical, like he might actually lunge at Jon. The security team moved faster, closing in from multiple angles, ready to intervene. You want to know the real problem, Harry? Jon said, finally standing up for the first time since the interview began. The problem isn't the institution you keep complaining about. It's not the media. It's not even your family or the way you were raised. The problem is you. You're so utterly convinced that everyone owes you something, that the world should bend to your will, that you can't see how incredibly good you actually have it compared to most people. Get him out of here, someone from production said firmly, and suddenly there were multiple hands on Harry's arms, gently but very firmly guiding him toward the exit at the side of the stage. Harry struggled against them, still yelling, still making a scene. This isn't over. You can't treat me like this. You can't just throw me out. Do you know what I can do? Do you know the lawyers I have? Do you know who I am? Jon sat back down calmly, straightening the papers on his desk with deliberate care. Yeah, Harry, we all know who you are. That's the whole problem. That's been the problem this entire time. As Harry was escorted off stage by 3 security guards, still shouting about lawsuits and consequences and how he'd make sure Jon regretted this, the audience sat in absolute stunned silence. Nobody quite knew what to do or how to react. Jon looked directly into the main camera with a slight smile. We're going to take a quick break, he said, his voice perfectly steady and professional. When we come back, we'll have someone who actually has something interesting to say, someone Who can handle a basic conversation? The feed cut to commercial. Backstage in the hallways, Harry was still arguing loudly with security, demanding to speak to someone in charge, threatening legal action against everyone involved, making scene after scene. But Jon was already moving on, preparing mentally for the next segment, completely unbothered by the chaos he'd left in his wake. When the show came back from commercial break, Jon addressed what had just happened with his characteristic bluntness and honesty. "Well, that was something," he said with a slight smile, and the audience laughed, relieved to have the unbearable tension finally broken. "You know, we invite a lot of different people on this show. Some of them are genuinely smart. Some of them are funny. Some of them are important and doing meaningful work. And then, sometimes, every once in a while, you get someone who thinks they're all three, but really isn't any of them." The audience applauded enthusiastically. They were back on his side completely, grateful for his honesty, appreciating deeply that he hadn't backed down in the face of intimidation. "I don't usually talk about my guests after they leave," Jon continued seriously. "I usually just let the interview speak for itself. But I think there's an important lesson here that's worth mentioning. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from or what title you have. If you act entitled, if you demand respect without earning it, if you treat people like they're beneath you simply because you were born into the right family, eventually someone's going to call you out on it. And today, that someone happened to be me." More applause rippled through the audience. Louder this time, more sustained. "The thing is," Jon said, leaning back comfortably in his chair, "I don't enjoy confrontation. I really don't. I'd much rather have a pleasant conversation with interesting people. But I also can't sit here and pretend that kind of behavior is okay. I can't smile and nod politely while someone talks down to me. To you, to everyone watching at home, that's not what this show is about. It never has been." He paused deliberately, letting his words sink in with the audience. "We've had presidents on this show who've taken far harsher criticism better than that and handled it with grace. We've had comedians who've been roasted much harder and laughed it off with good humor. We've had activists who've faced real persecution, actual danger to their lives, and handled difficult questions with more maturity and grace. So, when someone comes in here with nothing but grievances and ego and demands for special treatment, yeah, I'm going to push back. That's my job." The audience was with him completely now. You could feel it throughout the entire room, that collective agreement, that shared understanding that what they'd just witnessed was a small moment of justice in its own way. Jon shuffled his papers, signaling a clear transition to the next topic. "Anyway, let's move on to something more interesting and worthwhile. Our next guest has actually done something worth talking about, something that helps people." And just like that, as if nothing unusual had happened, the show continued smoothly. The producers scrambled frantically backstage, damage control already in motion, phones ringing off the hook. Harry was gone, physically removed from the building by security, his team already issuing carefully worded statements about disrespect and ambush interviews and how disappointed they were. But none of it really mattered. The moment had happened. It had been captured on camera for everyone to see, and everyone watching knew exactly what they'd witnessed. They'd seen a talk show host refuse to be bullied or intimidated by status. They'd seen a prince throw an actual tantrum when he didn't get his way. They'd seen the clear difference between someone who earned their platform through years of hard work and someone who was simply born into theirs. In the green room after the show finally wrapped, Jon's team gathered around him in a tight circle. Some were genuinely worried about potential backlash and lawsuits. Others were celebrating what they saw as a major victory. Jon just shrugged it all off casually. "He came in here thinking his title meant something special," Jon said, packing up his notes and personal items. "But this isn't a palace or a royal event. It's a talk show. And on a talk show, you have to actually be interesting or likable or at the very least capable of having a normal conversation without completely losing your mind." He wasn't any of those things tonight. One of the younger producers asked nervously if Jon thought Harry would really follow through on his threats to sue. Jon actually laughed at that. "Let him try if he wants," Jon said with confidence. Everything that happened tonight was on camera, multiple cameras from multiple angles. He made himself look bad all on his own. "I just asked reasonable questions. That's literally my job." And that was the simple truth of it. Jon hadn't attacked Harry unfairly. He'd simply refused to treat him like he was special. He'd asked the same types of questions he'd ask anyone else. He'd pointed out the same obvious contradictions he'd point out in any other interview. The only real difference was that Harry couldn't handle it, couldn't handle being treated like a normal person instead of royalty. As Jon left the studio that night, walking out into the cool evening air, he felt a genuine sense of satisfaction. Not because he'd embarrassed someone publicly, but because he'd stood his ground on principle. Because he'd proven that titles and status don't mean anything if you can't back them up with actual character. Because he'd shown that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth, even when the person across from you absolutely doesn't want to hear it. The story spread like wildfire. Clips of the interview went viral within just a few hours, shared millions of times across every social media platform imaginable. People took sides immediately, as they always do with controversial moments. Some defended Harry passionately, claiming Jon had been too harsh, too disrespectful to someone with royal blood, someone who deserved more courtesy. But most people saw it for exactly what it was: an entitled person getting called out publicly for their behavior and not being able to handle the consequences of their own actions. Jon didn't comment any further on the incident in the days that followed. He didn't need to add anything more. The interview spoke for itself clearly. And in speaking for itself, it became more than just a television moment that people would forget about next week. It became a genuine cultural touchstone, a reference point for ongoing discussions about privilege and accountability, and what happens when someone who's used to constant deference finally meets someone who refuses to give it to them. Back at his home that same night, Harry was reportedly absolutely furious, according to sources close to him. His team worked overtime through the night to spin the narrative in his favor, to make him seem like the innocent victim of an ambush, of unfair treatment. But the footage didn't lie. Anyone who watched the full interview could see exactly how it had unfolded, moment by moment. They could see Jon trying patiently to have a reasonable conversation. They could see Harry becoming defensive over simple questions, then angry, then completely unhinged and out of control. The next day, Jon opened his show with a simple, direct statement. "A lot of people have been asking me about what happened last night," he said calmly. "And all I can tell you is this: I treat every single guest the same way, with respect and genuine interest, until they show me they don't deserve it. What happened after that? Well, you all saw it with your own eyes." He didn't gloat about what had happened. He didn't pile on with additional criticism. He simply acknowledged the situation honestly and moved forward professionally. Because that's what real professionals do. They don't dwell on unnecessary drama. They don't extend conflicts beyond what's needed. They state their piece clearly and move on with their work. In the days and weeks that followed, other celebrities and public figures started weighing in with their own opinions. Some supported Jon publicly, praising his willingness to speak truth to power, to not be intimidated by status. Others criticized him harshly, arguing that he should have been more deferential and respectful to a member of the royal family. But Jon didn't engage with any of it. He'd said everything he needed to say during the interview itself. Everything else was just noise and distraction. The incident quickly became a teaching moment in journalism schools across the country, used as a case study in how to handle difficult interviews with grace. Students analyzed Jon's technique carefully, studying the way he stayed calm under intense pressure, the way he asked direct questions without being unnecessarily cruel, the way he refused to be intimidated by status or title or threats. For Harry, the fallout proved more complicated and long-lasting. His public image, already controversial and divisive, took another significant hit. People who had been sympathetic to his story started questioning his judgment and emotional stability. People who had defended him loyally started wondering if maybe, just maybe, some of the criticism he constantly faced was actually deserved and fair. But all of that came later. In the moment, on that stage, under those bright lights, it was just two men having a conversation that went badly wrong. One who believed deeply that his title and birthright made him untouchable and above criticism. Another who knew from years of experience that respect isn't given freely, it's earned through actions. And when those two completely different worldviews collided head-on, there was only ever going to be one possible outcome. Jon Stewart had built his entire career on speaking truth to power without fear. He'd interviewed presidents and challenged their policies directly. He'd hosted world leaders and questioned their decisions boldly. He'd brought on controversial figures and held them accountable for their actions and words. This was just another day at the office for him, another interview, another conversation. For Harry, though, it was something different entirely. It was a wake-up call, or at least, it should have been if he was capable of self-reflection. Whether he learned anything meaningful from the experience, whether he took any time to reflect honestly on his own behavior patterns, whether he seriously considered that maybe the problem wasn't everyone else but himself, that remained uncertain for everyone watching that dramatic night.